All souls were, are, and will be in the Oversoul. Souls, Atmas, are all one. All souls are infinite and eternal. They are formless. All souls are one. There is no difference in souls or in their being and existing as souls. There is a difference in the consciousness of souls. There is a difference in the planes of consciousness of souls. There is a difference in the experience of souls, and thus there is a difference in the state of souls. Most souls are conscious of the gross body. Some souls are conscious of the subtle body. A few souls are conscious of the mental body. And very few souls are conscious of the self. Most souls have experience of the gross sphere, world. Some souls have experience of the subtle sphere, world. A few souls have experience of the mental sphere, and very few souls have experience of the oversoul. Most souls are on the gross plane. Some are on the subtle plane. Few are on the mental plane, and very few are on the plane beyond the mental plane. Most souls have great binding. Some souls have little binding. A few souls have very little binding, and a very few souls have absolutely no binding. All these souls of different consciousnesses, of different experiences, of different states are in the Oversoul, Paramatma. The soul is Atma, and the Oversoul is Paramatma. If now all souls are in the Oversoul and are all one, then why is there any difference in the consciousness, in the planes, in the experiences, and in the states? The cause of this difference is that the souls have different and diverse impressions called sanskaras. Most souls have gross impressions. Some souls have subtle impressions. A few souls have mental impressions, and very few souls have no impressions at all. Souls having gross impressions, souls having subtle impressions, souls having mental impressions, and souls having no impressions are all souls in the Oversoul and are all one. Souls with gross impressions have consciousness of the gross body, Sthul Sharir, and have experience of the gross sphere. Souls with subtle impressions have consciousness of the subtle body and experience the subtle sphere. Souls with mental impressions have consciousness of the mental body and have the experience of the mental sphere. Souls with no impressions have consciousness of the self, the soul, the Atma, and have the experience of the Oversoul, Paramatma. Thus, souls with impressions experience the gross sphere through the gross body. That is, they experience different and diverse experiences such as seeing, hearing, smelling, eating, sleeping, clearing the bowels, and urinating. All these are experiences of the gross sphere. Souls with subtle impressions experience successively 3 planes of the subtle sphere through the subtle body, and in these 3 planes they have only the experiences of seeing, smelling, and hearing. Souls with mental impressions through the mental body or mind in the mental sphere experience only seeing, and this seeing is the seeing of God. Souls having no impressions, no sanskaras, through the self experience the infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss of the Oversoul. Sorry. The soul that is conscious of the gross body is not conscious of the subtle body, mental body, or the self. The soul that is conscious of the subtle body is not conscious of any of the others. The soul that is conscious of the mental body is not conscious of any of the others. And the soul that is conscious of the self is not conscious of the gross body, subtle body, nor conscious of the self. The soul that is conscious of self is not conscious of the gross body, not conscious of the subtle body, and not conscious of the mental body. The soul that has experience of the gross world does not have experience of the subtle world, nor the experience of the mental world, nor does it have experience of the oversoul. The soul that has experience of the subtle world does not experience the gross world, the mental world, or the oversoul. The soul that has experience of the mental world does not experience the gross world, the subtle world, or the oversoul. And the soul that has experience of the oversoul does not experience the gross world, subtle, or mental world. Thanks for the likes. Feel free to ask questions. That is the soul that is conscious of the self and has experience of the oversoul is not conscious of the gross, subtle, or mental body, and does not experience the gross, subtle, or mental spheres or worlds. This means that in order to have consciousness of self and to have experience of the oversoul, the soul must lose consciousness of the gross, subtle, and mental bodies. But as long as the soul is impressioned either by the gross, subtle, or mental impressions, the soul consistently and respectively has consciousness of the gross body, subtle body, or mental body, and the gross, subtle, and mental experiences are persistently and necessarily undergone. No, I don't read cards. The obvious reason for this is that as long as the consciousness of the soul is impressed by gross impressions, there is no way out except to experience these gross impressions through the gross body. Similarly, as long as the consciousness of the soul is impressed by subtle impressions, there is no way out but to experience these subtle impressions through the subtle body. Similarly, as long as the consciousness of the soul is impressed by mental impressions, there is no escape but to experience these mental impressions through the mental body. As impressions of the gross, subtle, and mental vanish or completely disappear, the consciousness of the soul is automatically and obviously directed and focused towards itself, and this soul then necessarily has no alternative but to absorb the experience of the oversoul, Paramatma. Now, gross, subtle, and mental bodies are nothing but the shadows of the soul. The gross, subtle, and mental spheres or worlds are nothing but the shadows of the oversoul. Just read the comments. Towards itself, the soul. Yes, exactly. So these, until you are one with God, you're really just experiencing shadows. There's nothing real until you experience yourself as Paramatma. So what I already read was a soul is called Atma, and well, the part I already read was that all souls, Atmas, were, are, and will be in the Oversoul, Paramatma, Souls, Atmas, are all one. All souls are infinite and eternal and formless. All souls are one. There is no difference in souls or in their being and existing as souls. So I'm going to go back to where it was. Uh-oh, did I lose my place? Shoot. Oh, here we are. Gross, subtle, and mental bodies are finite, have forms, and are changeable and destructible. The gross, subtle, and mental worlds are false. They are zero, imagination, and vacant dreams. The only reality is the Oversoul, Paramatma. Therefore, when the soul with its gross, subtle, and mental bodies experiences the gross, subtle, and mental worlds, the soul actually experiences in reality the shadows of the Oversoul with the help of its own shadows. In other words, the soul with its finite and destructible form experiences falsity, zero, imagination, and a vacant dream. Only when the soul experiences the Oversoul with itself does it experience the real with reality. When the soul is conscious of the gross body, then this soul identifies itself with the gross body and takes itself as the gross body. This means that the infinite, eternal, formless soul finds itself as finite, mortal, and having form. It's basically saying that we are all infinite, eternal, formless beings, but we're experiencing ourselves as the opposite. Impressions, sanskaras, are the cause of this ignorance. In the beginning, the soul, which is eternal in the Oversoul, at first acquires ignorance through impressions rather than acquiring knowledge. So, impressions are basically beliefs, as I'm inferring it. When the soul acquires a particular form, a body or sharir, according to particular impressions, it feels and experiences itself as being that particular form. Soul, in its stone form, experiences itself as a stone. Accordingly, in due course, the soul experiences and feels that it is metal, vegetable, worm, fish, bird, animal, man or woman, whatever be the type of gross form, and whatever be the shape of the form. The soul spontaneously associates itself with that form, figure, and shape, and experiences that it is itself that form, figure, and shape. Hi, Debbie. When the soul is, it's bedtime reading for you. When the soul is conscious of the subtle body, then the soul experiences that it is the subtle body. When the soul becomes conscious of the mental body, it experiences that is the mental body. It is only because of impressions or sanskaras that the soul, without form, the infinite soul, experiences that it is veritably a gross body or a subtle body or a mental body. The soul, while experiencing the gross world through gross forms, associates with and dissociates it from innumerable gross forms. The association with and dissociation from gross forms are termed birth and death, respectively. So we are constantly associating ourselves as being maybe a rock or whatever, and then disassociating, which you can call the DEATH word, which I probably am supposed to say. Ooh, witchcraft is the same. I'm not surprised. I think that this type of material is echoed throughout all. The Meher Baba says himself that religions are all like beads on one string, and there's the string is the core truth to it all. He also says that he is that string, but I would say that they're all kind of... Anyway. It is only because of impressions that the eternal, immortal soul, existing in reality without births and without deaths, has to experience births and deaths innumerable times. So it's because of our impressions that the eternal, immortal soul that we are, existing in reality, experiences the births and deaths in non-reality, basically. While the soul has to undergo this experience of innumerable births and deaths because of impressions, it has not only to experience the gross world, which is a shadow of the oversoul, and which is false, but together with it, the soul has also to experience the happiness, misery, and virtue and vice of the gross world. It is only because of impressions that the soul, which is beyond and free from happiness and misery, virtue and vice, has necessarily to undergo experiences of misery and happiness, vice and virtue. That's interesting. We don't experience happiness or misery in reality, only in the gross sphere. Now, this much is established, that the experiences of births and deaths, happiness and misery, virtue and vice, are experienced only by the gross forms of the soul while experiencing the gross world. But the gross form of the soul is a shadow of the soul, and the gross world is a shadow of the oversoul. Thus, all the experiences of births and deaths, virtue and vice, happiness and misery, experienced by the soul are nothing but the experiences of the shadow. Hence, all that is thus experienced is false. Atma, in reality, is Paramatma. Again, going back, what I already read was that, I just want to reiterate for anyone new in here, this is all souls are called Atmas, and the oversoul is called Paramatma, and all souls are one. They're all infinite and eternal and formless, and there's no difference in souls. So yeah, they're all part of the Paramatma, but it's like a drop of water in an infinite ocean. In order to clarify the relationship of Atma to Paramatma, we compare Paramatma with an infinite ocean, just like I said, and the Atma as a drop in this ocean. The Atma is never out of this limitless ocean, Paramatma. The Atma can never be out of Paramatma because Paramatma is infinite and unlimited. How can the Atma come out of or have a place beyond the limitlessness of the limitless? Therefore, the Atma is in Paramatma. After establishing the primary fact that the Atma is in Paramatma, we go a step further and say that Atma is Paramatma. But how? For example, let us imagine an unlimited ocean. Let us also imagine that we are separate, or take out one iota of ocean from the limitless expanse of this unlimited ocean. It follows then that this iota of ocean, while in the limitless ocean, before separation is ocean itself, and is not there in the shoreless ocean as an iota of the ocean, because of every iota of ocean, when not limited by the limitations of a drop, is unlimited ocean. So, I don't know if that made sense, but basically, when a drop of water in the ocean is indistinguishable from any other drop of water in the ocean, and it's indistinguishable from the ocean itself. That's how I interpret that. It is only when an iota of ocean is separated from the unlimited ocean, or is taken out of the unlimited ocean as a drop, that this iota of ocean obtains its separate existence as a drop of the shoreless ocean, and that this iota of ocean begins to be looked upon as a drop of the unlimited ocean. In other words, this book is a bit repetitive, but that's the idea. I think there are reasons for that. In other words, the infinite, unlimited, and limitless ocean itself is now looked upon as merely a drop of that infinite, unlimited, and limitless ocean. And in comparison to that infinite, unlimited, and limitless ocean, this iota of ocean, or this drop of the iota of ocean, is most finite and most limited with infinite limitations. That is, the infinitely free iota finds itself infinitely bound. Similarly, the Atma, which we have compared with a drop of the infinite ocean, obtains a seeming separate existence, though in reality it can never be out of the limitlessness of the limitless. Infinite Paramatma, which we have compared with the infinite, unlimited, and limitless ocean, which basically means you are never separate from God. But just as the iota of ocean acquires its limitation as a drop through being in the form of a bubble on the surface of the ocean, and the bubble bestows upon the iota of ocean an apparently separative existence from the infinite ocean, likewise the Atma or soul, which is in Paramatma or Oversoul, and is Paramatma, apparently experiences separative existence from the infinite Paramatma through the limitations of a bubble of ignorance with which the Atma shrouds itself. No sooner does the bubble of ignorance burst than the Atma not only finds itself in Paramatma, but experiences itself as Paramatma. The all is the one is the all. Through this limitation formed by the bubble of ignorance, self-created by the Atma apparently inherits a separative existence from Paramatma, and because of this self-created separativeness from infinite Paramatma, the Atma, which is itself infinite, unlimited, and limitless, apparently experiences itself as most finite with infinite limitation. Cheers. Thanks for sticking around. The initial urge. This is part 2. The initial urge and the journey of evolving consciousness. Let us now think of one unconscious soul. In the beginning, the soul had no impressions or sanskaras and no consciousness. Therefore, at this stage, or in this state, the soul had no gross form or body, subtle body, or mental body, because only the existence of gross, subtle, and mental impressions can give existence to gross, subtle, and mental bodies, and only the existence of these bodies can make possible the existence of gross, subtle, and mental worlds. Hence, in the beginning, the soul had no consciousness of the gross, subtle mental bodies, and was also unconscious of its own self. And the soul then naturally had no experience of the gross, subtle, and mental worlds, and also had no experience of the oversoul, Paramatma. This infinite, impressionless, unconscious, tranquil state of the soul reverberated with an impulse which we call the first urge, the urge to know itself. The first urge was latent in Paramatma. When we compare Paramatma, when we compare Paramatma to an infinite, unlimited ocean, and when we say that Paramatma got the first urge, it could also be said in terms of comparison that the infinite unlimited ocean got the first urge or the whim. In the infinite, both finite and infinite are included. Interesting. Now was this first urge infinite or finite, and was it at first finite and then infinite, or vice versa? The first urge was most finite, but this first urge was of the infinite. This most finite first urge was the infinite ocean, Paramatma, and the manifestation of this latent, most finite urge of the infinite was restricted to a most finite point in the infinite, unlimited ocean. But as this most finite point of manifestation of the latent first urge, which was most finite too, was in the infinite, unlimited ocean, this most finite point of manifestation of the first urge was also unlimited. Through this most finite point of manifestation of the first urge, the shadow of the infinite gradually appeared and went on expanding. This most finite point of manifestation of the latent first urge is called the Om point, or creation point. Om. Simultaneously with reverberations of the first urge, the most gross first impression emerge, objectifying the soul as the most absolute opposite and most finite gross counterpart of the infinite. Because of this most gross first impression of the first urge, the infinite soul experienced for the first time. Experienced is emboldened, so it experienced for the first time. This first experience of the infinite soul was that it experienced a contrariety in its identity with its infinite impressionless unconscious state. just reading a bedtime story, no big deal. This experience of contrariety affected changeableness in the eternal, indivisible stability of the infinite soul, and spontaneously there occurred a sort of eruption, disrupting the indivisible poise and the unconscious tranquility of the infinite soul with a recoil or a tremendous shock, which impregnated the unconsciousness of the unconscious soul with the first consciousness of its apparent separateness from the indivisible state of Paramatma, or oneness. But the soul, being infinite, the first consciousness that it derived from the recoil or shock of an absolutely opposite and most gross first impression of its apparent separativeness, was naturally and necessarily finite first consciousness. This is some very raw spirituality. That's what's going on here. Very raw. It's a little heady. The first consciousness derived by the soul is obviously most finite in proportion to the experience of the absolute opposites of its own original infinite state. It then means that in the beginning, when the impressionless infinite soul was first impressioned, it got as its first impression an absolutely gross impression, and the first consciousness it derived was most finite. Simultaneously, at that instant, the unconsciousness of the infinite soul actually experienced the most finite first consciousness of the most gross first impression. This infinite and eternal soul did get consciousness, but this consciousness by impression was not of its eternal state or its infinite self, but was of the most finite by the most gross impression. And gross is, whenever I say gross, what it means is material. It means the physical reality, the material world where we breathe and eat and poop and all that. Now, as will be explained later, if the soul is conscious of impressions or sanskaras, then the soul must necessarily experience these impressions. And in order to experience the impressions of the consciousness of the soul, must experience them through proper media. As the impressions are, so are the experiences of impressions, and so must be the media to experience the impressions. That is, the impressions give rise to experiences, and to experience the impressions, the use of appropriate media is necessitated. I think what it's saying is, if you live in the physical world and if you are impressed by that, then you have a physical body. And if same goes for the subtle body and the mental body. Therefore, as the infinite, eternal, and formless soul now has the most finite first consciousness of the most gross first impression, quite obviously and necessarily, this most finite first consciousness of the soul must utilize the most finite and most gross first medium to experience the most gross first impression. That is quite a sentence. At this stage, it suffices to mention here for the limited human soul, while experiencing the most gross first impression, centered itself in an appropriate most finite and most gross medium, imperceptibly tending the soul without form to as associate and identify its very infinite eternal self with this most gross and most finite limited form as its first medium. So I think that's saying the infinite soul that you are is experiencing the opposite of that, the most finite, limited form as its first medium. So it's saying that when you reincarnate, you start out as you're pretty much a rock, and then you reincarnate through all these lifetimes of being a rock until you get tired of seeing you no longer have the impression that you're a rock, and then you become like a vegetable or something, and then you become like a bird, and then an animal, and then finally a human, through associating and disassociating with these impressions. Thanks for the heart, me. The first consciousness of the indivisible soul, experiencing the first impression through the first medium, creates a tendency in the soul to associate and identify its eternal infinite self with the first form, the most finite, most gross, which was as the seed of the contrariety, spontaneously sown by the reverberations of the first urge, imperceptibly germinated and manifested for the first time in the shape of duality. When it is made to associate and identify itself by its newly gained consciousness with the finite gross form or medium, the consciousness of the soul actually makes the infinite, eternal, indivisible soul without form experience that it is that finite, gross form. This is, the cover's not on it, but it's called God Speaks by Meher Baba. And this symbol says mastery and servitude, and it's got all of the religions as beads on a string is what that symbolizes, and the underlying truth of all religions, cults, and spiritual practices. Thus, the consciousness gained by the unconscious soul, thank you, yeah, I think so too, instead of experiencing reality through unity and identity with the oversoul, Paramatma, experiences illusion through duality and identity with the gross form, multiplying diverse, innumerable impressions in a series of experiences while associating with the gross form and gradually gaining or evolving more and more consciousness, reincarnation. In order to understand more clearly and concretely how the consciousness gained by the soul gradually develops through the process of evolution, a little bit different terminology for evolution, let us examine that state of the conscious soul where the consciousness of the soul associates itself with stone form as the most finite and most gross medium, and the soul thus begins to identify itself as a stone. Actually, the consciousness of the soul utilizes the stone form only after innumerable cycles and ages of diverse experiences through diverse species of forms, of which there are 7 major different kinds of most finite and most gross gaseous forms, which cannot even be concretely grasped nor imagined by ordinary human beings. Oh, so it's saying before you see yourself as a rock, you have to become gas forms and other, probably like plasma or something like that. It is for convenience that we begin with that state of conscious soul when it just begins to associate and identify itself with stone form. In stone form too, there are varied species, and the consciousness of the soul has to utilize each and all of the species as appropriate media, one after another, in accordance with the diversity of impressions of the soul, to experience varied and countless impressions gathered one after the other in stone form. If we take stone as a medium for most gross impressions, it follows that the soul, which is eternally in the oversoul, now with most finite consciousness, experiences most gross impressions through the medium of stone form. It's a bit repetitive. I think that's to get it to sink in, and I think that's also for the future content of the book, because it gets more complex. I think the repetition is like a way of absorbing the material. It is thus that the infinite, indivisible, eternal soul without form, which is eternally in the oversoul, while experiencing the most finite gross impressions through its own most finite consciousness, utilizes the most finite gross medium of the firstmost species of stone. Firstmost meaning the very, very first. And the soul is thus imperceptibly, though spontaneously, made to identify itself as stone. After ages and cycles, the most finite gross consciousness is gradually much more evolved in the soul by innumerable and varied experiences of the most gross finite impressions through the identification of the soul with the first most species of stone. Eventually, when a limit to having experiences is reached, the identification of the soul with the firstmost species of stone is gradually dissociated, and that stone form is dropped. The soul remains now for a period without any medium, though the most finite consciousness which has been evolved remains together with the most gross finite impressions of the most first species of stone form just shed. Again, gross just means physical reality. Thus the soul, now without any medium or form, is conscious of the most finite impressions, sanskaras. But as long as consciousness is centered in impressions, the soul must necessarily experience those impressions. Therefore, in order to experience the impressions of the most first species of stone form dropped, the consciousness of the soul centered in the impressions of the dropped stone form begins to associate with the most next species of stone form. The soul identifies itself with this species of stone, and the consciousness of the soul begins to experience, through association with the new medium of the most next species of stone form, the impressions of the most first species of stone form. It's a mouthful. The most important point to be understood here is that when the consciousness of the soul dissociates its identification from one form or medium and retains only the impressions of the form so dissociated, these impressions are experienced through another appropriate medium when the consciousness of the soul associates with the next medium or form. But this next medium or form is always created and molded of the consolidated impressions of the last species of form with which the soul associated and identified itself, and which were retained by the consciousness of the soul even when dissociated from the form. Thus, innumerable diverse experiences of countless impressions experienced by the consciousness of the soul through diverse species of stone forms, one after another, lead to the greater evolution of consciousness of the soul. Ultimately, a stage is reached after ages and cycles of experiences where the consciousness of the soul has a tendency to dissociate the soul even from the most last species of stone form. And although the most last species of stone form is dissociated or dropped by the soul, the most finite consciousness evolved thus far remains together with the most finite gross impressions of the most last species of stone form dropped. The soul, now, without any medium or form, is conscious of the most finite gross impressions of the most last species of stone form. The soul must necessarily experience these impressions. Now, in order to experience the impressions of the most last stone form, the soul associates and identifies with another medium, the metal form. This medium of metal form is but the mold of the impressions of the most last species of stone form. In other words, the most first species of metal form is created and molded of the most last species of stone form impressions. And if you just joined, this is talking about reincarnation, and it's saying that your soul first gets the impression that it is a gas form, and then it becomes a stone form, and then metal, and then all the way, then animals, and then human, and then you start. That's what it's defining as evolution. Different use of the word evolution. And then you start involution, the process of returning to that oneness that is everything. All is the one, and the one is the all. There are diverse species of metal form, just as there are of stone form, and the consciousness of the soul utilizes these diverse, innumerable species of metal form as media through which to experience the diverse and innumerable impressions gathered. Thus, the evolution of the consciousness of the soul gains and gathers momentum in proportion to the diverse and multiple experiences of varied and innumerable impressions, though through different media or species of forms. This is how the cycles of evolution of consciousness, yeah, when I say evolution, it's the evolution of consciousness, not evolution, Darwin or whatever. This is how the cycles of evolution of consciousness of the soul go on evolving further in greater consciousness with evolution of forms of higher and higher species, while experiencing and exhausting the impressions of the dissociated forms of the lower and lower species. I have to plug my phone in. Perhaps. Okay, sorry about that. Uh-oh, did I lose my place here? Let's see. Here we are. The consciousness of the soul experiences... Yeah, I read that part. All right, these impressions of the most first species of the metal form are now experienced by the conscious soul through its association and identification with the most next species of metal form. This form is but the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most first species of metal form, which was dropped or dissociated by the conscious soul. A chain of varied species of metal forms is thus created, and the soul, or to be more precise, the consciousness of the soul, associates with and dissociates from every species of the metal form, exhausting and gaining diverse impressions. While experiencing these impressions, the soul evolves more and more consciousness simultaneously with the evolution of the higher and higher species of forms. After ages and cycles, at last the consciousness of the soul associates and identifies itself with the most last species of metal form to experience the impressions of the most last but one species of metal form that the soul has just dropped or dissociated. Good, this will. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. This soul, eternally in the oversoul, through being infinite and without form, finds itself as metal. And if you're just joining us, this is God Speaks, and it's what it's talking about is basically saying that all souls are one. The one is the all is the one, like drops in an infinite ocean. The drop is indistinguishable from the entire ocean and indistinguishable from any other drop in the ocean. But when we first get the impression that we are finite and not of the oversoul, we start out as gas forms and then metal, and then we reincarnate until we exhaust all our impressions of such a thing as we the evolution of the soul, the evolution of consciousness develops. While identifying itself with diverse species of metal form, the soul begins to experience simultaneously the gross world in accordance with and in proportion to the soul's experiences of the stone form and the metal form. The metal form, which includes a series of diverse species of metal, is as inorganic, inanimate, and solid as the stone form, which includes a series of diverse species of stone. The soul, or more precisely, the consciousness of the soul, while identifying itself with the species of stone and metal forms, finds itself as one with the stone or metal form, and thus realizes itself as inorganic, inanimate, and solid, and experiences these inorganic, inanimate, and solid states throughout the entire evolution of the stone and metal forms in the gross world. The solid, inanimate state of the soul is one in which life and energy are still dormant in spite of greater evolution of consciousness. Hence, the forms in the solid state cannot of their own accord move about by themselves. And therefore, the consciousness of the soul associating with these solid forms, which are inanimate and inorganic, and with life and energy still dormant in them, tends to assert recumbent horizontal positions rather than assert vertical upright stands or erect positions in the gross world. Interesting. So it's basically saying that your consciousness is kind of dormant in these forms, but it's still there. After ages and cycles of varied, innumerable gross experiences of diverse and innumerable impressions through a variety of species of metal forms, the consciousness of the soul eventually dissociates itself even from the most last species of metal form. Thus, the identity of the soul with the most last species of metal form is dropped. And as usual, the conscious soul now is once again temporarily unidentified with any form. It's like being in between lives, basically. In this state of the conscious soul, then there is no form with which to be associated. The consciousness of the soul is centered only in the impressions of the most last species of metal form, which has now been dropped. Thus, the conscious soul, in this state of having no form or identification, is conscious only of the impressions of the most last species of metal form. That's interesting. I don't know what that means. I think it sounds like even though you're not in a form, you're formless, you still kind of see yourself as that form. You still have that impression. And then you have to... and then it continues. The conscious soul must exhaust these impressions of the most last species of the metal form by the consciousness of the soul experiencing these impressions through some appropriate medium. And the appropriate medium to spend or exhaust these impressions of the most last species of metal form is the most first species of vegetable form. The species of vegetable form is nothing but the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most last species of metal form. When the consciousness of the soul associates now with the most first species of vegetable form, the soul, thus conscious, tends to identify with that form and actually finds itself as that species of vegetable form, quite oblivious of the reality that it is infinite, eternal, and without form, eternally in the oversoul, Paramatma. In this state of the most first species of the vegetable form, the consciousness of the soul experiences the gross world in accordance with and in proportion to the impressions it experienced and experiences of the stone forms, metal forms, and vegetable form, respectively. While thus experiencing the gross world, this consciousness of the soul identified with the vegetable form realizes now that it is vegetable and has half inanimate and half animate attributes. The conscious soul now asserts in the gross world all through this vegetable form as an upright erect stand. Although this form cannot stand independently of itself, it uses the support of other media to assert an upright stand. This form is still not capable, however, of giving the experience of voluntary movement to the consciousness of the soul. Yeah, that's weird. It says that when you're a stone, you only have like a horizontal consciousness, but when you're a vegetable, it becomes upright, which I don't know what that means, to be honest. After the impressions of the last most species of the metal form are exhausted by the consciousness of the soul through the most first species of vegetable form, this most first species of vegetable form is dropped, i.e., the consciousness of the soul dissociates itself from this most first species of vegetable form. Again, the conscious soul realizes that it is without form altogether, although the evolved consciousness is there, dormant. This evolved consciousness of the soul is now centered in the impressions of the most first species of vegetable form just dropped or dissociated. To experience these impressions of the most first species of vegetable form, the consciousness of the soul, now without any form, utilizes an appropriate medium, which is the most next species of the vegetable form. This most next species of the vegetable form is nothing but the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most first species of vegetable form. This goes really into detail. By association with the medium of the most next species of vegetable form, the consciousness of the soul experiences in the gross world the impressions of the last species of the vegetable form just dropped. When these impressions are exhausted through diverse experiences, the consciousness of the soul relinquishes its association with the most next species of vegetable form and again experiences that it, the soul, is without gross form and that its consciousness is centered only in the impressions of that species of form last dropped. And I have to do a puzzle. Boom, nailed it. Again, to experience these impressions, the consciousness of the soul tends the soul to identify with the next species of vegetable form. This chain of impressions, experiences, and species of form, one after another, is so linked that it is apparently endless, and the consciousness of the soul, in order to evolve itself fully and completely, has no other course but to become entangled in this vicious circle until perforce the consciousness of the soul thus gained makes the soul realize that it is infinite, eternal, and eternally in the oversoul, and makes the soul experience infinite power, knowledge, and bliss. The point that is important and which is to be carefully noted is that as the cycle of evolution of consciousness of the soul rolls on, and further and greater consciousness is evolved through experiences of further and greater impressions, this evolution of consciousness inadvertently evolves a series of forms of higher and higher species while exhausting the impressions of the lower and lower species that get dissociated or dropped or shed. Thus, the gap between the beginning and the end of a series of species of one particular form, such as stone form or metal form, or vegetable form or other forms, beginning with the lowest or crude most first species of a form of particular kind and ending with the highest or sublime most last species of form of that particular kind, is progressively filled in by the evolution of forms of higher and higher types suitable to the impressions and aiding the consciousness of the soul to gain higher and higher consciousness. In short, in between the most first and most last species of form of a particular form, there are diverse species of forms that of that particular form evolved to suit the requirements of the evolving consciousness of the soul. Coming to the point when the consciousness of the soul associates itself with the most last species of vegetable form, the conscious soul identifies itself with this most last species of vegetable form and experiences the impressions of the most last but one species of the vegetable form that was last shed. When all the impressions of this most last but one species of vegetable form are exhausted, the conscious soul no longer identifies itself with the most last species of vegetable form, because the consciousness of the soul has dissociated itself from that most last species of vegetable form. This most last species of vegetable form is also eventually shed by the conscious soul after ages and cycles of experience of the whole vegetable kingdom through the gross world on the earth and in the waters. Although the most last species of vegetable form is shed by the conscious soul, and the soul is now without any form, yet the consciousness evolved is there, and through this consciousness the soul, though without form, is conscious of the impressions of the most last species of the vegetable form just shed. These impressions must necessarily be spent or exhausted. In order to experience these impressions, the consciousness of the soul now associates with an appropriate medium to experience these impressions of the most last species of the vegetable form. Therefore, the consciousness of the soul thus tends the soul to identify itself with the most first species of the worm form. It must be remembered that this form of the most first species of worm form is nothing other than the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most last species of vegetable form. While the conscious soul thus identifies itself with the most first species of worm form, the soul realizes that it is actually a worm and becomes worm conscious. Despite all of the consciousness so far evolved, the soul is still not conscious of its reality, its original, infinite, eternal state, eternally in the Oversoul. Although the soul is eternally in the Oversoul and is infinite and without form, this partially conscious soul actually experiences itself as a worm in the gross world. This is ignorance. This ignorance persists as long as the consciousness of the soul is not fully evolved. But even when the soul has come to full consciousness, it is still said to be enveloped by ignorance, because this fully evolved consciousness does not make the soul self-conscious instantaneously. On the contrary, when the consciousness of the soul is fully evolved, the soul begins to identify itself as a human being. While the consciousness of the soul associates itself with the most first species of worm form, it experiences and exhausts the impressions of of the most last species of the vegetable form. When all the impressions of the most last species of vegetable form are completely exhausted or spent through the diverse experiences had by the soul while identified with the most first species of worm form, then this most first species of worm form is dropped or dissociated, and the soul is once again without any form, although it is conscious of the impressions of the most first species of worm form. All right, that is a convoluted sentence. I think it means that the soul drops that impression, becomes formless, and then reincarnates into the next form, but it doesn't know anything beyond what the last thing it reincarnated from is. That's my interpretation of that. These impressions of the most first species of worm form must be experienced and exhausted. Therefore, the consciousness of the soul associates itself with another appropriate medium and tends the soul to identify with the most next species of worm form. This medium of the most next species of worm form is nothing other than the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most first species of worm form. Species after species of worm form are thus molded and dropped, while the consciousness of the soul rapidly evolves through experiencing the varied impressions of worm forms through diverse species of worm forms. When the conscious soul is a worm conscious and experiences itself as a worm in the gross material world, the consciousness of the soul also has for the first time the experience of voluntary movement, and also experiences that it is an animate creature. This worm conscious soul, in its travail to gain more and greater consciousness, also experiences itself in the gross world as an invertebrate, and at a later stage in other states of vertebrae, limbless, creeping worm forms of diverse species. In other diverse species of worm form, the consciousness of the soul undergoes further varied experiences of voluntary movement through crawling, through pairs of legs, and sometimes through multiple pairs of legs, and sometimes through pairs of legs and pairs of wings. Sometimes the worm-conscious soul in varied species of worm form realizes itself as possessing a hairy surface, sometimes smooth and silky, and sometimes rough or scaly. The worm-conscious soul also realizes more acutely that it has to struggle for its sustenance and also for its survival, and that it is endowed with the sensation and life. Cute little worms. This worm-conscious soul, with further evolution of consciousness through greater and varied innumerable experiences of varied multiple impressions of varied species of worm form, also experiences and realizes that it is an amphibian, that it has not only voluntary movement on earth, but also freedom and mobility in water. For our own convenience in understanding the evolution of consciousness more clearly, we include in the worm form the varied species of worms, varied species of insects, varied species of reptiles, amphibia. In short, we include in the worm form all species that tend to crawl or that crawl in spite of having limbs, legs, and wings, or that are otherwise distinct from birds and quadrupeds. The stone and metal forms had no upright or erect stand. They were recumbent forms. Their posture was flat and horizontal. The vegetable form had an upright stand. Now the worm form is again of the recumbent type of form, which has no upright or stand, but is prone to have a prostrate posture. When the consciousness of the soul associates itself with the most last species of worm form, after experiencing all the impressions of the varied species of worm form, and when the conscious soul eventually drops or sheds this most last species of worm form, after ages and cycles of multiple diverse experiences in the gross world, the conscious soul again finds itself without any association or identification with forms. But the consciousness of the soul is now centered in the impressions of the most last species of worm form just shed. These impressions must necessarily be exhausted through experience, and to get experience a suitable medium is necessary. It sounds like the meaning of life right there. To get experience, a suitable medium is necessary. That might be the reason we're all here. This is the kind of answers this book is talking about through a very repetitive and detailed synopsis. Therefore, back to the book. Therefore, the consciousness of the soul, being centered in the impressions of the most last species of worm form, associates with an appropriate medium and tends the soul to identify itself with the most first species of fish form in order to experience and exhaust the impressions of the most last species of worm form. This fish form is nothing other than the consolidated mold of impressions of the most last species of worm form. As soon as the impressions of the most last species of worm form are exhausted through experiences, the most first species of fish form is dropped or shed, because the consciousness of the soul dissociates from the most first species, and the conscious soul no longer identifies itself with that species. Although the conscious soul is now once again temporarily without form, yet the consciousness of the soul is centered in the impressions of the most first species of fish form. In order to experience these impressions of the most first species of fish form, the consciousness of the soul associates itself with a suitable medium and tends the conscious soul to identify itself as with the most next species of fish. This species is nothing but the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most first species of fish form. After ages and cycles, and after innumerable varied impressions of diverse species of fish forms are experienced and exhausted, the consciousness of the soul eventually associates itself with the last fish form in order to experience and exhaust all the impressions of the most last but one species of fish form. Thus the fish conscious soul, identifying with varied species of the fish form, experiences in the gross world that it is a living creature in water, a vertebrate endowed with life, sensation, and voluntary motion, an animate creature with limbs modified into fins, and that it has to struggle for sustenance and survival. So, interesting realization that I'm gaining from this is that all these, once you're basically a worm, you are aware of yourself, is kind of what I'm getting out of this, perhaps. Or maybe it's when you become a fish, I don't know. The fish-conscious soul does not experience an upright, erect stand, but it experiences itself as a recumbent that can never hold its head high and assert an upright stand in the gross world. Whenever I say gross, it just means material, in the material world. The fish-conscious soul eventually sheds or drops its identity with the most last species of fish form. As soon as the consciousness of the soul has experienced and exhausted all the impressions of the most last but one species of fish form. Thus the consciousness of the soul once again finds itself without identification, without any form. But the consciousness of the soul is conscious of impressions of the most last species of fish form. These impressions of the most last species of fish form must be experienced and exhausted, and therefore the consciousness of the soul now associates with another suitable medium, and thus tends the soul to identify itself with the most first species of bird form, which is but a consolidated mold of the impressions of the most last species of fish form. In the most first species of bird form, the consciousness of the soul experiences and exhausts the impressions of the most last species of fish form. When all the impressions are thus exhausted, the consciousness of the soul dissociates itself from the most first species of bird, and the conscious soul drops or sheds its identity with the first species of bird form. The conscious soul is once again without form, but it has consciousness centered in the impression of the first species of bird form that just dropped. These impressions must be experienced and exhausted, and therefore the consciousness of the soul automatically associates itself with the most next species of bird form, and tends the conscious soul to identify itself the most next species of bird form, which species is but the consolidated mold of the impressions of the first species of bird form. On and on, ages after ages and cycles after cycles, this chain of successive associations and dissociations with varied species of particular form moves onward and steadily and progressively, and gives out innumerable different impressions to be experienced by the conscious soul, directly and indirectly. These associations and dissociations of the consciousness of the soul are absolutely essential to keep the wheel of evolution of consciousness revolving. The evolution of gross forms is but a byproduct in the universal factory of evolution of consciousness. Wow. The bird conscious soul identifies with one species and with the next and the next species of bird form, one after the other in regular succession, until all the species of bird form are associated and dissociated alternately by the consciousness of the soul, while experiencing multifarious impressions in the gross world. And thus the evolved consciousness of the soul tends the soul to realize itself as bird in every species of the bird form. Though the soul is eternally without form and in the oversoul, yet the bird-conscious soul consistently realizes that it is no other than a bird in the gross world, experiencing bird impressions on earth, on water, and in air. It realizes itself as a feathered vertebrate, capable of flying in the air, and with the help of two legs, it maintains an upright posture. Eventually, after ages and cycles of experiences of varied species of bird form, the bird-conscious soul sheds or drops the most last species of bird form, as soon as the consciousness of the soul dissociates itself from the most last species of bird form. And the consciousness of the soul dissociates itself from the most last species of bird form as soon as the conscious experiences and fully exhausts all the impressions of the most last but one species of bird form in the most last species of bird form. I feel like they could have paraphrased a lot of this. Again, the conscious soul experiences itself as being without any form for the time being, although the consciousness evolved further and greater is always there. Once consciousness is achieved by the soul, this consciousness goes on evolving more and more and can never be lost or devolved. That's interesting. You can never go backwards in the reincarnation process. As far as the evolution of consciousness is concerned. This consciousness of the soul without form now gets centralized in the impressions of the most last species of bird form just dropped. These impressions must necessarily be spent or exhausted by the consciousness of the soul. Therefore, the consciousness associates itself with a suitable medium and thus tends the conscious soul to identify itself with the most first species of animal form. Through this most first species of animal form, the consciousness of the soul experiences impressions of the most last species of bird form that was dropped or from which it was dissociated. The most first species of animal form is nothing other than the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most last species of bird form shed. And after innumerable diverse experiences of the impressions of bird forms, you experience animal form. The consciousness of the soul completely exhausts the impressions of the last bird form and then automatically dissociates itself from identification with the most first species of animal form. In this manner, form of the species is shed by the conscious soul, or the form that the species is said to have dropped. Again, the conscious soul with greater evolved consciousness finds itself without form, although the consciousness of the soul is centered in the impressions of the form just discarded. of the most first species of animal form. These impressions of the form just dropped of the most first species of animal form must be experienced or exhausted by the consciousness of the soul, so that the conscious soul should not be aware of any impressions of any form, but be conscious only of the reality of its own infinite eternal state, without forms or impressions, and through knowledge experience the oversoul. Throughout the travail of the soul to gain that consciousness for itself, which would make it realize the reality of itself, the conscious soul goes on in an apparently unending chain, with its consciousness endeavoring ceaselessly to experience and exhaust all impressions that centralize the consciousness of the soul, deviating this consciousness from the reality of the eternal and infinite state of the self, to the consciousness of duality, of illusion, of the material world. Thus, the consciousness of the soul, in an effort to gain consciousness of the reality of the self, is consistently shrouded in an envelope of ignorance. Therefore, get some water. You can look at my magic card while I'm getting water. Okay. Therefore, in order that the consciousness of the soul should experience and thus exhaust the impressions of the most first species of animal form, the consciousness of the soul now associates automatically with an appropriate medium which will permit and aid it to experience the impressions of the most first species of animal form. This association of the consciousness of the soul perforce tends the conscious soul to identify itself with the most next species of animal form. This next species of animal form is no other than the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most first species of animal form. And again, impressions are your beliefs, what you think you are. Like, right now I'm under the impression that I'm a human being. That's kind of what it means in this context. As soon as the impressions are experienced and exhausted through the most next species of animal form, this species is dropped by the conscious soul. The soul once again experiences that it is not identified with any gross form of the gross world. When the animal conscious soul is without any form, the consciousness of the soul is centered in the impressions of the most next species of animal form just dropped. Thus, impressions must also be experienced in order that they may be exhausted, and therefore the consciousness of the soul automatically associates itself with another medium, and this perforce tends the conscious soul to identify itself with the most next to the next species of animal form. After ages and cycles of varied and innumerable associations with and dissociations from diverse species of animal form, the consciousness of the soul eventually associates itself with that medium which tends the conscious soul to identify itself as being the most last of the last species of animal form. Phew. All throughout the experiences of the animal conscious soul, the soul identified itself through its consciousness with varied species of animals in the physical world, in water, on earth, and below the surface of the earth, and realized the experiences of an animate creature, usually as quadrupedal organized being, endowed with life, sensation, and voluntary motion, and which all the while had to struggle for sustenance and survival, sometimes as an herbivorous creature and sometimes as carnivorous. The animal form has no upright posture and has a tendency to look down with drooping heads. Apes, however, are the most evolved types of animals, and they tend to stand like human beings. Ultimately, after ages and cycles, when all the impressions of the last but one species of animal form are experienced and exhausted through the medium of the most last species of animal form, the consciousness of the soul dissociates itself from the most last species of animal form, and the conscious soul no longer identifies itself with this most last species of animal form. This form is dissociated by the consciousness of the soul and is dropped or shed. However, the most last species of animal form is dropped or shed. The impressions of the last species of animal form are left or retained, and the consciousness of the soul is centralized or focused on the impressions of the most last species of animal form. The conscious soul is once again without form. These impressions must necessarily be experienced and exhausted, and hence the consciousness of the soul now associates itself with another suitable medium, and the soul perforce tends to identify itself through its own consciousness with the most first human form. This human form is no other than the consolidated mold or cast of the impressions of the last species of animal form. Through the most first human form, the consciousness of the soul experiences and exhausts the impressions of the most last species of animal form. Thank you for the likes. When all impressions of the most last species of animal form are experienced and exhausted by the consciousness of the soul, then the consciousness of the soul dissociates itself from the first human form, and the conscious soul automatically drops or sheds the body association. This is called the unalive of the most first human form. But the consciousness of the soul is now focused or centralized in the impressions of the most first human form, and the soul is now temporarily without form. In order that the impressions of the first human form may be experienced and exhausted, the consciousness of the soul associates itself with another appropriate medium, and the conscious soul is thereupon inclined to identify itself with the most next human form, which form is no other than the consolidated mold or cast of impressions of the most first human form just dropped or shed. This identification of the conscious soul with the next form and those following is called the birth of human being. As soon as the consciousness of the soul associates with the most first human form, the evolution of consciousness is full and complete. Here we have some variants from the earlier impressions. So that's very interesting, actually. It's saying that once it's the first impression of human happens, and then you drop the body and reincarnate into the next one, and then your evolution is complete right after that. It's like you have, I don't know, the first impression of being a human, and then you reincarnate, and then your evolution is of the consciousness is complete. Because the consciousness of the soul is fully developed in the human form, the evolution of form is also complete, and no new higher forms are now evolved once the conscious soul identifies itself with the most first human form. Oh, I'm sorry, I take that back. So as soon as you're a human, your evolution of consciousness is full and complete. So we've evolved our consciousness from the state of the most finite form of like gases and rocks and metals, and reincarnated all through all the vegetables and animals and all of these things are us, and they're all one soul. And we've reincarnated through all of that, through so many reincarnations, just an imaginable amount. And that's how far we've come. So give yourself a pat on the back for that. Because the consciousness of the soul is fully developed in human form, the evolution of form is also complete, and no new higher forms are now evolved once the conscious soul identifies itself with the most first human form. In short, in human form, the consciousness of the soul is full and complete. The process of the evolution of consciousness is brought to a standstill. The human form is the highest and most sublime form evolved during the evolution of consciousness. Hence, in the human being, consciousness is fully developed, and the form molded and cast after ages and cycles is the most perfect form or medium. The consciousness of the soul therefore utilizes this perfect medium to experience and completely exhaust all impressions, so that the fully conscious soul becomes devoid of any impression whatsoever, and thus is able to realize its own real, eternal, and infinite state in the Oversoul. So that was chapter 2, the initial urge. And we just read through every reincarnation up to a human. And that's where I'll stop for tonight. Thank you for being here. I'm sure you all must be asleep, but I am grateful for you sticking around. Oh, you're liking the live, you're here. So yeah, thank you for listening, and maybe I'll keep doing this. I literally did this because I'm so bad at reading on my own that I thought this might be this way I can actually read the book if I just practice reading aloud. It's just us. All right, I'm gonna end the live. Thanks for being here. Good night. Aw, you're sweet.